Okay, hello, and welcome to the Blackletter Brunch. I'm Raul Martinez, and our presenter is calligrapher, artist, editor, and teacher Coral Rohrs. His presentation is entitled The Poster, Its Journey from Vienna Secession to San Francisco Psychedelia and Beyond. Now, let's see. Let me share my screen here. Now, Carl, looking at the diptych that shows Rollers and Wilson's artwork side by side, I can definitely see the similarity in their styles.
Yeah. We'll try and make that connection.
Yeah. Let's see. Let me try to view participants, okay. Spotlight you, and then we can start.
Okay, let's get that off the screen as quickly as possible. There we go. Okay, so it's the theme of the day has definitely been established here, and I thought I'd start by showing you these two different exhibitions. These different poster exhibitions from obviously first decade 20th century, and then this show, which was probably this century at the Museum of Modern Art. And it's interesting that right now, next week, San Francisco MoMA is having an exhibition called The Art of Noise, and they will be getting their collection of posters out again. So I'll remind you of that when we get to the end. But to start with, let's put it in context by showing you what the poster was, just before the Vienna Secessionists and the revolution of simplicity that happened in the first decade of the 20th century. So this is Jules Chéret. He's considered the father of the Parisian poster, and then Toulouse-Lautrec, of course. And the interesting thing about Lautrec, this poster on the left was his very first poster for Moulin Rouge. And he was hired to do this poster because the man who was running the Moulin Rouge was tired of Chéret's posters. He had done more than a dozen posters for them, and he wanted something fresh. And this poster caused a sensation. It was influenced by the craze for Japanese art that was happening in Europe, especially in Paris at that time. The silhouettes in the background apparently is something that's very much a Japanese thing. And the starting of the flattening of the colors was kind of important for stuff. And down in the corner, I've got David Singer's logo for T-Lautrec lithography, which is the printer for most of the psychedelic posters in San Francisco in the 60s. And then, of course, Alphonse Mucha, he was Czechoslovakian. He wouldn't have been Czechoslovakian at that time. He was Czech. He was from the Czech Republic, and but he really came to fame in Paris. But he was internationally known, even in the United States. He came and did posters here in the United States for a while. And in the days before there was broadcast, radio, music on the radio, or any kind of media that could be broadcast, print, of course, was king. And so visual artists like this were gigantic stars, and Mucha was one of the biggest ones. Mucha, by the way, was in he did belong to the Vienna Secessionists later, which is kind of interesting. It was an actual association, and he was part of it. No, you're not going to do this to me, are you? There we go. And here's just a few more posters of that time, Paris posters of that time. And the important thing here is that you could see that the standard of the day was that there was all this detail and lush detail, lots of colors, lots of things going on, and somewhat realistic in the shading of the characters and the scenes and stuff. So, and then finally, this is German work from that same time. These are both 1889, Emil Doppler and Karl Brunner. So the revolution that started the modernist movement, besides Lautrec starting to simplify and bringing a modernist painterly approach to the poster, was this movement, not movement, but these two men in England in the 1890s, the Beggarstaffs, and they were actually brothers-in-law that I think Nicholson married Pride's sister, and they tried to do posters together, and they only lasted 5 years because the public just could not appreciate it. But that Hamlet poster was their very first one, and it was made with the black is cut out paper, and the color is stenciled on brown butcher paper. And there's I wasn't exactly sure when I was reading about this, where they were saying that these were stenciled, that they may have made these posters themselves and stenciled the black, stenciled the beige, stenciled the peach color. But it could just be that the original happened. And the thing is that all the posters have not survived. And the original, I think the original may still be around, but the reason we can see this is because it was saved from a publication, that it was printed in a publication. But they were really important for this idea of flattening colors and simplifying things. And like in this poster, letting the background color into the main figures color fields and stuff. So ultra simplistic. And it began in England, which was not a hotbed for avant-garde design. And here's two more on the left by the Beggarstaffs. Really simple, really, they caused a sensation, but they did not cause any commissions for the Beggarstaffs. The Don Quixote was a poster for a play, and it wasn't even printed because the producer of the play didn't think that the picture looked enough like the actor who was playing Quixote in the play. But hugely influential on the two men that were the biggest, the most important artists in the German world of the poster movement that came next, Ludwig Holbein, who's on the right here, and Bernhard, Lucien Bernard, who we will see in a minute. But you can see how gigantically influential the Beggarstaffs were on Holbein, especially in this coat on this page. And then again, the flat colors, he's kind of posterizing the colors, which is isolating, breaking down something that would have continuous tone into simple flat colors. Although Holbein did a really cool thing and started to put texture in. So I'm going to show you a couple of Holbein posters, and these are a little bit later because he's really using this idea of texturizing the flat planes of color. But see how the background is going into the shadows, and there's no edge, there's no outline. That's a real Beggarstaff thing. And did Steve Hosmer come in yet? Steve, are you here? Steve is my sign painting poster pal here in Santa Cruz, and he specializes in collecting stuff about these guys. And he knew a little bit more about this process. But these were stone litho plates, and the texture was achieved by mixing mineral oil and water in the areas on the stone to cause the etching to have this mottled look. So you can see the early version of it here. And this is an American poster, by the way, on the right, that he was definitely German. He was located in Munich, and his heyday was, the first century of the 20th, first decade of the 20th century, up through the 30s. So this would have been probably mid-teens or even into the 20s for the poster on the right. And look how beautifully stylized this texture is getting. I'm crazy about both of these posters. Huh. And two last posters by Holbein before we get to Bernhard. And also you can see, a lot less detail and a modernist approach to the way they're putting the lettering in, very much like what was going on with the German expressionists, and which is part of secession as well. So here's Lucien Bernard, and the thing about this section is everything that I've got in this section was in the story about Bernhard 5 years ago. And so we'll go through here this a little bit quickly, because some of you could go back and read this article to be reminded. But the Priester matches is the sort of the representative poster for the movement, which was called the Sachplakat, the object poster. And as a reaction to how floral, what do I want to say, decorative the poster situation was in Europe in the 1890s. This was simplicity, knocking, it's the forerunner to minimalism, actually. And the huge legend about this was that he designed this poster by painting a scene with a checkered tablecloth and an ashtray with a cigar in it, and the smoke was going up, and the smoke was intertwining, turning into dancers, the smoke was two dancers interacting. And he showed it to a friend, and the person said that it looked like a great ad for a cigar, and it was supposed to be for the matches. So he went back in and he started eliminating things that were unnecessary until he ended up with just the name of the company and these two matches. And he entered it in this competition, a Priester match competition. And the judges hated it so much that they threw it away. It was in the wastebasket. And then the head judge, who was late, showed up, pulled it out of the trash, called the rest of the people idiots, and said, "This wins the competition." But it turns out that it wasn't that simple, that was just a legend. And here is the original poster. And the simplification happened over a period of time under the direction of the person who may or may not have been the judge of the contest. So, and all the simplification, the hilarious thing about the simplification is that he wasn't redesigning it, he was just erasing stuff. So the first picture had the box of matches, and it was determined that wasn't necessary. So they just cut off that half of the poster. So here on the right was the next step. And then they decided they didn't need this copy, and they got rid of that. I actually did this mechanically, but this was an illustration in one of Hosmer's books from that time period, one of the magazines, that was the ad, and it still had this fuller name. And this version of it was done 10 years later. This is all 1903, by the way, that this happened. And between 1903 and 1915, Bernhard had become a gigantic success. He had an atelier with 30 people working for him by then, doing all kinds of advertising. And they just redid this poster 10 years later as an homage or a commemorating that time period. But the legend is, and you can still find it online if you look up this poster, people will still be telling you this story about that this arrived fully formed, and he was an overnight sensation. He practically was an overnight sensation, but it took this kind of evolution to get there. So here's a few of my favorites. They're all in the magazine. The Coffee Hog, he had done lots of other posters for this company, but this was for the decaffeinated coffee. The colors are just so wonderful, and the image is so crazy. And and to start with, he was doing flat colors, just like the beggar staffs. He had seen a poster exhibition just after the turn of the century where he saw the beggar staffs and he saw all the European work that was going on, and all of it influenced him, no question. And so it was very flat to begin with. And then later he started to keep the simplicity, but putting in more detail and more color. And that's really typified by this light bulb, where we're seeing the refraction and the distortion of the letters, as well as the reflection on the light bulb. And, just so exciting. So a couple other things. The mascot for the show was the Der Concentrator illustration. I always love this. So I added all that color, but this was the original. And I'm not sure if this was some sort of medicine or some sort of method for improving your mind's action, but this was the ad. It just says, concentrate your thoughts with concentrator, then read triple without overwork. He was called by other contemporaries of his the father of modern advertising, and the Manoli cigarettes, he was theoretically the first person to have taken over all of their advertising, so that he did logo design, poster design, advertising, and just made all of it hang together, which apparently was a completely new thought in 1910. And so he did lots of stuff for Manoli, and I love the one on the left, how casual that lettering is, and more of this stuff. His early posters all had this really bold, rough-edged letter, which influenced type design, because that I'm sure some of you know the typeface Block, Berthold Block, and it's a little family of typefaces. There's a condensed one and a really bold one and a lighter weight one, and it was designed by Louis Oppenheimer, who took it right from Bernhard. And when Bernhard saw that, he decided that he should get into the type design field as well. So his first was this family called Bernhard Antiqua, and the one that really lasted throughout the 20th century was the bold condensed, which is what we see here. And it was an early sign painting favorite of mine because it was so casual. You know, it wasn't as demanding as a really crisp Roman with sharper serifs, that I could paint these blunt serifs without tape or without being careful. So I could paint this fast, besides it looking so great. Look at this G, the lowercase g. Parenthetically, I was carving signs with another guy for a while, and we had a guy that hung out with us and helped us, and his name was Gary, and he insisted that his nickname should be lowercase g. Here's his first Blackletter typeface, and the extra fat, which is extra bold version of this, was something that Bernhard called the tuba in the Frochter Orchestra, because it was so bold. And this is a poster. I've got this hanging on the wall, and supposedly it's original from the time. It's printed on newsprint, and it's I think it's fundraising for World War I for the German government. Bernhard was drafted into the army during World War I, but they quickly realized that because he was famous, they quickly realized that they should have him working, doing graphics for the cause rather than being a soldier. And this is one of those. So here's your Blackletter, everybody. And then this script, Bernhard cursive, the extra bold of this is one of my favorites. In fact, Steve Hosmer and I went in together and bought this metal type, and we don't have presses. It's never been printed. We just wanted the type. So I found this type specimen, and all this stuff is pages from the type specimen. I found it at Oaklander Books. Did you ever go to Oaklander Books in New York City? He was on the 5th floor of a warehouse in Soho and specialized in graphic publications. And he had a big stack of type specimens I would always go through. And when I found this, I had never seen this in any Bernhard book. And I had to have it. And it was stupid expensive. And oh boy, I really went back and forth, but I decided I'd probably never see it again. So I overspent on this thing, but glad I have it. After he moved to the United States, he started coming to the United States to work in 1922, and he moved here permanently in 1927. And after he came to the States, he started to design more sophisticated typefaces, and they weren't as bold, and they were smooth and precise looking typefaces. And these are a few of them. I'm sure you've seen Bernhard Modern. He really has an identifiable look. He never believed in designing text faces. He only did display faces because he thought that text faces had been done to perfection by Jensen's. He specifically called out Jensen, but other classic typefaces. He just wasn't interested in text faces. And he thought of display typefaces like posters, like, ephemeral things that the style would change so often that he would design new ones and figure there was a market for a new hit record or, something new. And he thought of typefaces that way as new products. So he kept designing them. I think I've told you guys before that I saw a headline in a newspaper. It was in some sort of, maybe a documentary or maybe even a something that was meant to be period. And it was a newspaper that had Bernhard Gothic as the headlines. And I had just never seen anything so stylish in a movie before. I wish I had somehow got a picture of it. But yeah, I'm ridiculously excited about stuff like that. So a little bit more of his work. This book jacket on the lower left is the printed jacket, and then upper right is the bound version. So they did a cloth, uh, spine on it. And as he got in the 30s, when he wanted to retire from graphics, he gave his graphics business to his sons, and he began to do paintings of women, were what he amused himself with through the 40s and 50s. And then he tried to get back to work in the late 50s and 60s and asked his sons to give him work, but they couldn't find clients that wanted his style, which is interesting now because he's so revered later, but he couldn't get back into graphics. The public didn't want him. But he did, while he had moved to the United States, he kept his atelier in Berlin and turned over the running of it to this man, Fritz Rosen. And so Bernhard worked in the United States and Rosen worked in Germany. And these are all Rosen designs. And Bernhard at one point said that he trusted him so much that he knew he had his style down, for one thing, and that he also was such a wonderful draftsman and so clever that he said that some of his very best ideas were Rosen's. And this last thing we'll show you here is there was a story in Grabowsgraphic magazine, I think in 1927. Steve had this in a bound book of, a volume of Grabowsgraphic, and it was trimmed this way so we can't see the date, but it's talking about how this brand new idea of Bernhard, of them being intercontinental, that Bernhard was in New York and Rosen was in Berlin, and Rosen did this painting. So finally, Steve Hosmer is a sign painter here in town and a poster designer, and he is totally enamored with this whole world. You wouldn't believe his library. And here is some of his local posters. And the great thing about Steve is he paints them like signs. He paints great big, they're like 3 or 4 feet tall. And then he paints them like signs and photographs that and has them printed for posters. And he does commission posters as well as lots of posters on his own that are all local Santa Cruz landmarks. So this is my favorite of his posters for Pearl Alley, which is a specific little block here in Santa Cruz. And he's inlaid a piece of abalone, and the cat is a schmaltz cat. And schmaltz is the old sign painter's technique of adhering black ground glass to a sign surface so that it sparkles the way it catches the light. And you can see this here. And we took this out in the sun just to light up the schmaltz a little bit more. One time at a letterhead meeting, somebody showed up and they had a can of iridescent black schmaltz. And we made a sign of it, a team of us. I was lucky enough to be on that team. And we did a great big sign with German words on it and used up all of this iridescent schmaltz. It was really fun. And one last one, this is another of my favorites, the Begonia Festival in Capitola. They make floats on boats in the Capitola Creek out of flowers, kind of like our Rose Parade, but begonias are a big flower in this area, a big product in this area. And so they call it the Begonia Festival. And I love this one that he made the begonia in the sky look like a firework. Steve, are you here? You're supposed to be here. he was late coming out to Cabrillo the other day. I said, "Oh, you can watch it on Sunday." So, and he's not just psychedelic with he's not that psychedelic with the posters, but with a camera, he really is. He goes out before dawn and captures these fantastic sunrises around Santa Cruz. So this is the lighthouse at the harbor. Anyway, back to the topic. Here's Wes Wilson, the famous poster called The Sound, and how it began, of course, was Vienna Secessionist posters, specifically this one by Alfred Rohler. And the Vienna Secessionists were a reaction to, and the names are so similar that I get them backwards. There was a group of a group of artists in Vienna called the Association of, oh, I wish I had written it down, the Association of Austrian Artists. That's what it was, the Association of Austrian Artists. And these people that formed the secession group believed it was too conservative. And so they left and started their own group. And this is about 1893, I think. And so they made this gigantic turn away from the Association of Austrian Artists and called themselves the Union of Austrian Artists. So huge, they just made a huge mark between the two of them, but they really became to be known as the secessionists. And Gustav Klimt was the first president. So it was all the arts, architecture, product design, furniture design, all kinds of stuff, as well as graphics. And Rohler was one of the main guys for the graphics. So here's the list: Joseph Hoffman, the architect, and Coleman Mosher was another painter and poster designer. Gustav Klimt, of course, the painter. Lots of the posters were long and tall like this. And this is just something that I found on the web that was designed recently. Somebody summing up what the secession was. One of the first things they did was build themselves their own building, the Secessionist building, which was designed by Joseph Maria Olbrich, and he designed this poster too that shows this. And a really interesting, horrific thing actually is this building was torn down during the Nazi occupation. That the Nazis, once they occupied Austria, they came in and they tore this building down as a representative of degenerate art. Not just, the whole secession. This was at a time when teachers were losing their teaching posts, not just because they were Jewish, but also non-Jews were getting stripped of their teaching posts and arrested because of the art that they did that was not Aryan enough for the Nazi Party. But this one, they tore this building down, and as soon as World War II was over, they recreated it and built it the same way. So this is still here, and it's actually on the back of an Austrian coin up until the euro took over as the monetary unit in the European Union. But it used to be on the back of the 50 kroner coin or whatever, monetary unit they had at the time. This was that famous. And inside there was a temporary exhibition called For Beethoven. The central piece was a statue by Max Klinger, and they turned the whole building over to it. And Klimt painted these friezes right on the wall. They were meant to be temporary, but after it was over, Klimt's main patron went to great expense to take these paintings off the wall, and they were filling rooms, the walls on these rooms, and they were saved and then sold to a Jewish family, and then the Austrian government looted them during the World War II period and put them back in the secession building. And actually there was a big movement of trying to get the paintings returned to the family who had bought them, that they were looted from by the government, but somehow it was decided that they really belonged to Austria, and they were installed in the basement of the secessionist building in the 1970s. So apparently they are still there, but really famous for Klimt, uh, although I had never seen these before, I started doing the research for this. Other Vienna secessionists, Egon Schiele, of course, was famous for it. So this poster on the left, I know you've seen that. And the one on the right, I believe, is the beginning of Neuland. That this letter style really represented German expressionism. And when Koch went to first design Neuland, um, we've talked about this before. He had never cut punches himself before. He had always designed the letters himself, handed them over to the Klingspor's technical department, and they would cut the punches for the typefaces. And Koch decided he wanted to do that. So he started with Neuland, and this is 1923. And I think it was twofold. One, he wanted to do this letter style, but two, he wanted to make it easy on himself to cut these punches. And they just weren't as demanding as a really exact serif face or a blackletter face, that he could be expressionistic when he was cutting the punches himself, as well as, not having it be that demanding. And the other part of typeface design is that for each point size that was cut, and he cut every point size by hand, was that they would attempt to make the type the same from point size to point size, although the smaller sizes would be a little bolder than the bigger sizes, which would be more refined for display. So there was that kind of adjustment, and it was that exact. Whereas Koch just went in and grabbed these punches for every point size and whacked away at them, and all the point sizes of all the different, all the letters for all the different point sizes are very different from point size to point size. But this is the style that's come to represent the secessionist poster. And I find it really interesting that if you go to Wikipedia and look up secessionists, roller is not even mentioned. I thought it was a real sin this week when I found that out. But this is the first of the psychedelic styles that I ever tried to teach myself, for lettering when I was in high school, because it is relatively simple. And all you do is you draw a top and bottom line and then count the numbers that you want in a line of lettering and divide it up and just draw vertical strokes. And then all you're doing is drawing this line, this stylized line, into the positive area of the, so you're drawing the negative line to create the positive thing. So you can get these big, wide, it's easy enough to make a block of lettering be the shape that you want or centered or whatever it is, because you're just knocking out blocks rather than having to draw the letters and guess where it's going to be, if it's centered or if it's going to have a shape or anything like that. So here's a couple pictures of Roller. I thought I'd show it because it looks like he would, fit into my circle of friends pretty easily. Really good looking guy. And this is later. And he did draw the letters, I suppose you could see the division of space could be figured out the same kind of way, but these are some of his things. The magazine for the Vienna Secessionists was called Versacrum, which meant something like, not silent spring. Sacrum is spring in Latin. It's alliterative. I know it is. It's senile spring. That's what it is. Because I can't remember these things. I look them up and remember. But look how psychedelic these letters are. I love this. I tried to translate this, but Google Translate, no matter what if I figured this was an O or a D or anything, it just kept it the same. So it's some sort of exhibition, and I have no idea what Schlossd Ostulong is, but it looks like it might be a play that's a tragedy where somebody's head gets cut off. Is there anybody here who speaks German who knows what this might say? Keep going. And, from our last issue of Alphabet, Louise's great article about the women of the Klingspor, we knew that Rudolf von Larisch married one of his students. And it turns out that Roller did the same thing. He married one of his students, Meliva Roller, and she was also a designer. Well, she was, taking his classes at the academy where he taught, and he married her right out of school, I guess. But this is a poster of hers and a woodcut. And there's this great new book by from Letterform Archive that's a reproduction of this 2-volume publication of the Vienna Secessionists, and it's called Die Flaka. And one of the things they said in there was that the women were unusually successful doing woodcuts. So this picture on the right, the illustration on the right, is Meliva Roller, a woodcut of hers. And then here's the huge revelation that I got on this one in the Die Flaka book. Just 2 days ago, I was over at Steve's taking these pictures, and in the Die Flaka facsimile was this poster that I always had thought was Rollers, but it was done by a man named Adolf Böhm. And I don't know how I missed it, because he signed it down in the right. And I saw this poster in Hamburg on a trip. Well, here it is, and it's in red and blue in the Die Flaka book. But the poster, definitely, this poster, took this picture live in Hamburg. The poster is in yellow, but in the Die Flaka book, it was reproduced in red and blue, and also some of Roller's other work. In fact, the Wes Wilson kind of lettering was also done in red and blue in the book. But these were the two things of Boehm's in the book, and clearly marked with his name. And here's a close-up, although it's blurry, but I took this picture in Hamburg, and now I'm wondering if the card that labeled this in the museum was mislabeled Roller, that I thought that it was him all this time. The other poster designer and graphics man was Coleman Moser, and he was kind of made famous. Well, he was famous before, but Paul Shaw and Garrick Bogue designed this typeface in the mid-90s called Colo, and it's still available. And obviously by the name, they were pointing right at its inspiration was Coleman Moser. And here's another one of his posters. And these are the two Rollers in Die Flaka, and you can see that poster that was those other colors before are using the red and the blue. So I think it had to do with the printing colors, that they weren't, they were trying to maximize the amount of pages they could with the same color scheme. And finally, the Versacrum calendar in 1903, the illustrations are by different artists on the right, but every month is in Roller's Wes Wilson style. I just ran across something the other day that named this, and it was called curvy block lettering. And then he reduced it to initial. He was calling it the CBL lettering, but he was mostly talking about Wes Wilson. So we're going to get to, this should be where we jump to San Francisco in 1966. But talking about psychedelia, there's two people from the 20s that are so crazy psychedelic. Oops, before we get there, this is a Dutch painter, poster designer, Charles Verschuren Jr. And just one more thing of what was going on at that time period. And look how crazy great the one on the right says the night butterfly, and it has something to do with this social butterfly. And then this is pot cleaner. Poets pasta is it says cleaner in Dutch, and I was hoping that madness was Dutch for madness, but it was just a name. So just a couple of Verschurens. But the two guys I want to talk about, and again, we did in that same issue with Bernhard, we did Hans Thaddeus Hoyer, but look how crazy psychedelic he was. The one on the right is from the Officina Serpentis publication of the Divine Comedy. And so this says Purgatorio, and his New Year's greetings on the left. And then here's my favorite, El Paradiso, and talk about psychedelic. And the other thing that's, so great about this is that Hoyer did the drawings, but these were cut in wood by Bruno Rollitz. So just like Zopf and Rosenberg, uh, the marks that you actually see in the typefaces and in pen engraver and all that stuff, you are actually seeing Rosenberg's hand. And here with Hoyer, you are seeing Rollitz's hands doing the work for him. And look how elaborate this is. It's just so wonderful. Below that is Hoyer's logo for Officina Serpentis, the publishers, another really gorgeous thing. And then the other super psychedelic artist in the we're going to say the late teens to the 30s for his psychedelic work, but he was really famous before that as the designer of this kind of work for Liberty and Company in London from 1897 into the mid-teens was Archibald Knox, who also taught in England. And in the mid-teens, he had been dismissed from his teaching post. He taught both at the V&A and especially at this other school, and he was dismissed, and he just said to hell with it, and he quit and went home to the Isle of Man, where he spent the rest of his life working on this project I'm about to show you. But it's just the most psychedelic thing ever. It's called Deer's Cry, St. Patrick's Hymn, and he worked on it for about 20 years. These were all little watercolor things where he took St. Patrick's Hymn, which is mostly just the man, St. Patrick, beseeching God to protect him from all the dangers of the world. So it's, dear Lord, protect me against, in this case, against the snares of demons. Oh, there's a typo. Against snares of demons, against, oh, I spelled that wrong too. Against seduction of vice and against lust of nature is what this one says. And this is the title page, Deer's Cry. And the VNA actually has a few originals, and here is one that is in the VNA. This is a photograph of the actual little watercolor, and it's only about this big, really tiny. And the reason they have a few at the VNA was that when he left London, kind of in disgust, he took all the work that was in his desk there and threw it in the wastebasket. And one of his followers, one of his students, pulled all the stuff out of the wastebasket and left and gave it to the VNA, and it's in their collection, so you can see them there. And but if you want to see the originals of the published Deer's Cry, you have to go to the Isle of Man. So here's another. This is not related to the Deer's Cry, but you can see his style. It's just so psychedelic and so illegible. It was kind of amazing that somebody in the 1920s was so wedded to it. I would have loved to have known his thinking process of it. And the interesting thing is that, psychedelic San Francisco is the seed for that was the Vienna Secessionists, but Roger Dean, who is British, I can see Knox's influence on Roger Dean and all those Yes album covers and stuff. So here finally is my favorite, where it just says the word against is that central image. So it's AGA, there's the I, and it just goes farther and farther back, that against is just this one big mandala. And then in the corners, it says poison, burning, drowning, wound, and death. Protect me against those. So beautiful. And Margaret, do you remember I took these pictures in 1910, and I was teaching for Margaret had arranged a workshop for me in England, and she and Jeff dropped me off at a train in Manchester, and I took the train to Liverpool. To get to the Isle of Man, you have to take a ferry up the Mersey River and out into the channel, out to the Isle of Man, which is 15 or 20 miles off the coast of England on the west. And I just did it on a whim. went out there, went to the museum in the Isle of Man and asked, "Could I see the Archibald Knox Deers Christ stuff?" They said, "Don't be silly. You have to write us in advance." And so I get to see them. Margaret, you remember that when you dropped me off
How
to go?
could I forget? But it was 2010, not 1910.
Oh,
I'm
did I
not
say
that old.
1910? Yeah, 2010. But they, you know what they did have is they had photographs of every piece that they had. And there were dozens and dozens more. I have a catalog of it that has 20 or 30 pieces in it, and there were dozens more. And they let me take photographs of the photographs they had. And if I ever get a chance to go back, just like any place that you go to a museum and you want to see stuff, write them ahead of time and tell them you're coming and ask for what you want to see, because it wouldn't have been any problem. But the guy behind the desk has said, what kind of an idiot are you? Do you think that we just keep them here? They're off, they're off site someplace in storage. So you have to ask ahead of time.
But
So,
then what you have to add to that, Carl, is the fact that you used the photographs both from the Isle of Man and the Victoria and Albert when you came back 3 years later,
oh,
and you gave us a presentation about him then.
I forgot about that.
It was not wasted,
Oh,
not
good.
self-indulgent.
Oh, and and I did get to see all the images of it, but there's something about the photograph being just a little fuzzy, and they'd been
Yeah.
pretty old. Anyway, as psychedelic as it gets, and he worked on this up until his death in 1933, just kept cranking these things out. So I'm guessing this is mid-20s or something. And here's one more. He had a few pieces where the quote had Christ in it, and he did a gigantic X to represent Christ. So just like Christmas, and I guess it must not be that sacrilegious, because obviously he was a religious man to want to spend the last 20 years of his life working on this project. But this says, "Christ, protect me today." And it has kind of a psychedelic Celtic knotwork in it going on too. Uh, the, this is the style, this one, and um, this is repeated over and over. So he had this big round lowercase letter that he liked to use a lot, and that's why I enjoyed the against so much, because he was departing from that a little bit. But so anyway, let's get to San Francisco, and but we're going to jump ahead a little bit and show you that this letter style has become so ubiquitous in its meaning for our time, for that time, I mean the psychedelic 60s, that there are these typefaces that always refer to that time period rather than the secessionist time period. So this is one you can, if you have the subscription to the Adobe products, you have access to the typefaces, the Adobe Type Collection. This is one you can get for free. It's called Mojo. This is one called Love, and it's a squarer one. Mojo is more vertical. And Love was released, I forget the foundry that put this out, but it was released in tandem with this one called Peace. So Peace was this square thing, and Love was the more soft-edged, like the secessionist style. But the crazy thing about this is from their, online type specimen. And you can see that the capitals flow one way and the lowercase flows another. So when they were typing this in, and there's a solid and an outline and a solid outline, that when they were making this, they capitalized the P and the O and the S and the P when they type these things in, and the rest is lowercase, so they don't line up. How stupid can you get? That these are obviously meant to be either, they were just giving you two versions of it. It's not like these are the lowercase. It's just that's where they put the characters. So really funny that the S and the O are bumping stomachs, and the O and the U, and the P isn't as bad, but you can see that it's flowing opposite the way these flow. So finally, we get to Wes Wilson, and when the early things that Wilson did, and the overwhelming majority of the posters that he did, he used this style over and over again. And the thing that is, he did it beautifully, but you can see that the way this is constructed, it just means that you can draw any kind of shape and then divide the that horizontal shape into these vertical shapes in any way that you want, and then you have the formula for turning them into the letters. So talking about San Francisco psychedelia, what's called the seed of the psychedelic poster is this one from 1965, and it was for a dance at the Red Dog Saloon in Virginia City, Nevada, in the summer of 1965. And not only was this the beginning of the psychedelic poster, this was also the beginning of the ballroom scene, the dance hall scene in San Francisco, that this crazy scene of hippies that was beginning in Virginia City was attracting people from San Francisco to come up and start to, take LSD and dance and go, all this freedom really happened there. And those people started coming back to the city and starting that. Chet Helms and the Family Dog definitely has its seeds in Virginia City, and came along from that. So this poster was designed by two members of the band, the Charlatans, Hunter and Ferguson. And another early place that we would see these kinds of things, I'm going to show you Rick Griffin. We're going to see a section on Rick in a second, but the Human Being was in January of 1967, and it was this first place where they called it the Gathering of the Tribes, which is a phrase that's still used to this day in Moon Alice posters, where besides all the bands that were playing, you can see all these sociological big shots. Ginsberg and Leary and Alpert and Ferlinghetti, all these people were talking and reading their poetry and beseeching the crowds to do things between the bands. And this is the place that Timothy Leary first said, tune in, turn on, and drop out, was from his speech at the Human Being. And the different poster artists of the day all did posters for it. So this is Rick's version of it. And the reason I want to show you this here is that it has this Western, wanted poster look of mixing typefaces that feel Western, but have this psychedelic kind of flow. And this poster is obviously this Victorian kind of, has this Victorian kind of feeling. In fact, these guys, look how Hunter was dressed up. They dressed up from, different time periods, these costumes. So it was all of this beginning of the counterculture with fashion, as well as what was going on in the dance halls and the drugs, of course. And one of the reasons for the be-in was that LSD had been declared illegal just 4 months before this, in October of 1966. So they had this event as part of a, thumbing their nose at the powers that be, to because everybody was, taking acid while they were at this thing and it was in Golden Gate Park. So these posters evolved quickly. Lots of people did these posters, but there were this group of people, these group of guys called the Big Five. And from left to right, it's Alton Kelly, Victor Moscoso, Rick Griffin, Wes Wilson, and Stanley Mouse. Here is the same guys in 1987 celebrating 20 years of the Summer of Love, and look how they got all these posters behind them. It was kind of a common thing for them to wallpaper the walls with the posters for various things. And left to right there, it's Wilson, Kelly, Mouse, Victor, and Rick. And I thought I had Mouse's, I guess I don't have Mouse's be-in poster, but here are two posters from the 1980s where they're celebrating the 20 years anniversary of that. And Victor on the left, the lower part of that poster is very much Victor's style. We'll see more of that when we get to his section. And then Rick's beautiful Jimi Hendrix at Monterey poster from that time. And here's the original artwork of that. It's actually a little bit of a bummer that he chose to print the image reversed, because God, it looks just so wonderfully like him, but so casually drawn. He's holding the lighter fluid in his hand, from when he poured it on his guitar and set it on fire at Monterey Pop. really beautiful stuff. So in the latest issue of Alphabet, we talk about David Singer, who we're going to get to in just a second. And I was sort of saying you could add David Singer to the big five, but really the person who is the sixth person of the big five was Bonnie McLean, and she did lots and lots of posters in lots of different styles. Plus, she was working for Bill Graham and ended up being married to Bill Graham, and so she was practically running the Fillmore with him. And uh, and the only other image that I have here is the poster of hers that she did in chalkboard calligraphy, because she always did artwork on the chalkboard at the top of the stairs of the Fillmore. So these are, it's just another case for Bonnie McLean being the sixth five. But Wes is who we sort of hung our hat on to start with. So you can see here all these different ways that he liked to use Rohrs letters. And I don't want to make light of the fact that they are beautiful designs, but I know how easy Rohrs' system made it for this lettering to happen. So it's really fun to see him saying, man, I can just go any place. I can make these letters flow however I want them to. And he knew that he could fall back into what was going on with that. So on the right here is a poster, and the postcards were printed at the same time as all the posters. They ganged them up. And what we're seeing on the right is the poster, one poster that was pulled out of the print run before they got to the purple layer. And collectors love these things that show the process and stuff. And here's one last thing for Wes's section, and this is Gary Houston, who is a Portland poster designer and really prolific, does wonderful stuff. If you went online and did Voodoo Cat Box or Gary Houston, you'd see a lot of his stuff. But look at his modern angular take on the Wes Wilson style. I love these letters. I'm going to show you just a couple of Gary's posters. The other thing that you should maybe think about is that there is a psychedelic poster show in October, every October in Golden Gate Park at the Hall of Flowers. So if you keep your eye out for that, it's really tons of fun to go to that. And Gary always has the northwest corner, and he's so prolific. He does lots of things that have a woodcut style, and he's all over the place with his stylization. I'm going to show you a Rick Griffin version, and this was, of course, his Wes Wilson version of the lettering. So a great one to look up. And again, before we leave here, this is a brand new album, just came out this year, where they discovered this Doors tape of the Doors at the Matrix, which is the San Francisco nightclub that a lot of these people played at while the Fillmore and the Avalon were also getting going. And I love how geometric they've made the letters here. It's probably a typeface, the second line. And then, of course, the Doors is in that stylized Futura block, which was the last Blackletter Brunch that I presented, was this block lettering. And they're making a really interesting correlation between those two things, as well as these great colors. So that brings us to our guest today, Amity Parks, who has just recently started becoming fascinated with this style of lettering. I'm going to show you a couple of things. Amity does ceramic work. She's always done ceramic work ever since I've known her. And here's a little, I think this is a pot, unless it's just a tiny little, supposed to be a mushroom. So I'm thinking the lid, and so pre-firing and then fire. So it's the top of the vase and the pot. And Amity, can we get you to talk a little bit about this now before we go on?
Sure. Yeah, it's a pot. You're right. That's a lid that comes off, and the word is Steinpilz, which is a German word for a mushroom.
Oh, I thought you said it read stencils, is how I read it.
Oh, no, yeah, it's a little hard to see because it goes under the lid, but it says Steinpilz.
Oh,
Yeah.
fantastic. Okay, so how did you decide to get into this style of stuff?
Well, I've always been fascinated by looking at the posters because of the lettering aspect. And so I just decided to dive into looking at them, but there's so many and so much that I just focused on Wes Wilson, probably for the same reasons you said, is that you can analyze how those lines of text are designed and broken up into this formula of wavy guidelines and uprights. And so, yeah, I just was fascinated by the colors, by the way things fit together, by the illegibility of them, and just started playing with it.
Great.
I haven't done a lot of history. There isn't a lot, it's a little hard to find historical information about them.
Uh-huh. Well, I only showed you one poster of Rollers where he used that style. And so it was just that Wes must have seen that one poster and took off from there. But on the lower left here, this is Jurgen Verkamp's business in Bruges, the Morris Coffee and Crafts. So did you do this right on site, or did you do it before you went?
I was there last fall, and I was teaching a workshop in his studio, and there was this interesting bee-like fly in the window, and so I took a picture of it. And so when I teach the Wes Wilson lettering class, I do this imagery where you can stylize an imagery and add some pictures to it. And so I just took the photo of the fly, and which ended up being a common European hoverfly.
Oh,
so I just, for fun, put that together for him.
Cool. So so Amity is teaching workshops in this style, and here's one last one. So she could lead you through it. But I love the way you're using the colors with all this stuff. It's so great.
Thanks
a lot. Okay, so here we're just going to go sections of of my favorite of the big five, and here's Stanley Mouse. This is a picture that was taken by the Life magazine photographers. They did a whole issue on psychedelic poster artists, and this was Stanley back in 1967. His real name is Miller, but he's of course known to all of us as Stanley Mouse. His most famous early poster was this one of the Grateful Dead, where he just used Omar Khayyam's illustration from the Rubaiyat and colorized it, but it became, a huge part of the culture. Skulls and Roses, there's so many things called Skulls and Roses having to do with the dead. And this lettering, top and bottom, is really Stan's invention. And it is the quintessential spindly psychedelic lettering. Rick took this in a completely different direction, but it really was influenced by this. Rick came from Southern California. He was called north by the Fosters very soon and became part of it immediately. But look at how they missed the color on one of these things. My next door neighbor, right across the driveway from me in my little townhouse association, was a great friend of mine. And he had an original version of this. And someplace down in here, there is a place where the halftone of the blue dots kind of meld into each other. And it's the giveaway that you have a first printing that makes this poster worth thousands of dollars compared to the later printings where they had a better halftone on it. But I would think that the missing rose, the missing red in the rose here would be part of it as well. And the interesting thing about Mouse is that he was part of another lowbrow culture before he became a psychedelic poster artist. And he used to work for Ed Big Daddy Roth, doing airbrushing t-shirts and designing stuff for Ed Big Daddy Roth. And he had this character on the left whose name was Freddie Flypogger, was this guy with the, hugely long gear shift and his hand way out to here and the teeth and the eyes. And Roth stole that from him and put ears on him and made him Ratfink. And Ratfink, maybe you have to be as old as me to remember, but in, with model cars that you would put together with, that you would glue together, model car kits, there were lots of Roth, things, with cars that look like this that you could make out of models. And Ratfink was a huge part of that in the 60s, but began with Stanley Mouse. And then he became the psychedelic poster artist. And this is going to relate to Rick Griffin in a second. This is a Letterhead's favorite, one of the Letterhead's favorites. This album cover, the Grateful Dead's very first, and there was a poster, used this letter style from a favorite book of the Letterhead, Strong's Book of Designs from 1910. This was an alphabet in the back of the book. And this was a book that was made for sign painters, just as a source book for sign painters, and is kind of the second most famous from that time period. Atkinson's sign painting is the Bible. But we always loved that we knew the source where Stanley got these letters came from the Strong's Book of Designs. And there's a second alphabet in the back of Strong's Book of Designs that Stanley used for a different poster. I didn't put it in the show. But here's his quintessential psychedelic letter that is his design. We got the original on the right and the printed version below, and busted. So this was a fundraiser for the mime troupe for raising legal fees, a concert for that. And I love that they have Buster Keaton in the poster when the name of the event was Busted. And just more, and you can see that we think of this real specific thing with psychedelic posters, but over and over again, different things came from old Western looks. So this is a psychedelic version of a, wanted poster lettering style. And here he's using Lombardic versals and psychedelicizing Lombardic versals. And here, finally, this is a 21st century psychedelic poster that is using Lombardic versals, a little bit psychedelicized as well. I didn't get this artist's name, sorry. Stanley was partners with Alton Kelly throughout the 80s, throughout the 70s into the 80s, and they did lots of things together, both of them. And this is another Grateful Dead album cover, one of my favorites, American Beauty. Really gorgeous. Airbrushed to look like an inlaid marble thing in a table, but that's just an airbrush. And a self-portrait of the two of them. Here's a picture. Stanley's got an airbrush here. They were really famous for doing lots of airbrush stuff. And an interesting note, and Stanley is still alive and doing well, so this is good, but he had to have a liver transplant back in the 80s, and it wasn't from drug or alcohol abuse. It was from breathing atomized paint from all the airbrushing that he did. So it was a success, and he's doing great, 30, 40 years later now. But wear your mask, kids. Another of their collaborations for a Grateful Dead album cover, and this one, it says Ugly Rumors here on the album cover, but it's so dense with outlines and deep shade and detail in the lettering itself. That wasn't enough. They printed it upside down and backwards. So it reads Ugly Rumors, and it's upside down. So here, as an exclusive, I've flipped it right side up, flopped it so that it's not backwards and it's right side up. And you can still barely read that it says Rumors there. But the other psychedelic direction they went on the very next Grateful Dead album cover was to start to leave stuff out and only have just as little information as you needed to be able to read the letters. Look at the G, and this is a sketch by Stan, and they actually tried a different way, but really inventive type stuff. And Stanley ended up doing all the Journey album covers into the 80s with the really elaborate airbrushed wings. All their album covers kind of look the same. They were very different, but they all had this same feeling. And when I was first alphabet editor from 89 to 92, I screwed up my courage and approached Stanley about doing a story about him in Alphabet. And I went up to visit his studio, and he gave me this huge box of pencil sketches and he let me have them for months. I just brought them back to Santa Cruz. We counted out there were exactly 50, and I had them for so long. I think he was surprised when he got them all back. But this was we just did a 2-page spread on Stanley Mouse's sketchbook. And one of the things in the sketchbook was this abstract letter. I just thought it was great. I put it on the correspondence page. And finally, there's this modern rock band called Moon Alice who commissions a new poster for every single concert that they've done. And they have done over 1,300 concerts now, and there have been 1,300 posters. And Stan has only done a couple. Here's one of them. He also did an album cover for them. And I wanted to put this in here because it's got a flying eyeball on it, which is a huge symbol for the psychedelic poster world. And here's the most famous example of that. Rick Griffin's flying eyeball poster for Jimi Hendrix, John Mayall, and Albert King. It was both for concerts at the Fillmore and the Winterland with the same billing. We've got the original drawing on the right and the poster on the left. And this really is acknowledged as one of the most famous psychedelic posters of all time. But the imagery did not come from Rick. It came from the famous pinstriper and car guy from the 50s, Von Dutch. And Rick saw the flying eyeball on the dashboard, the metal dashboard of a car that Von Dutch had restored, and used it for the psychedelic poster. And this is a picture of Von Dutch with pinstriper swords in his ears and a third eye, as well as his hand airbrushed shirt. He airbrushed that shirt for himself. And I know you know this name Von Dutch because in the turn of the century, there was a clothing brand, which was a gigantic rage that used Von Dutch's name. They had licensed the name from him. I think he was still alive at the time, or if not, his heirs. And they still are out there. I don't think it's nearly as in style as it used to be, but this is the crusty old guy that it came from. So Rick, like Stan, was famous from a different kind of youth culture. And Rick was actually at the forefront of 3 different ones. When he was in high school, he started drawing cartoons for Surfer magazine in Southern California, and he invented Murphy. So I can't imagine anybody not knowing about Murphy from Surfer magazine, but that's because I was in Southern California when I was a kid. And at 12 years old, I learned how to draw from looking at Rick Griffin. And so here's Murphy on Surfer magazine, and a huge moment in my life. I know this is going to sound pathetic, but I was in a record store in Chicago. We moved from Southern California to Chicago. It was a gigantic tragedy in my life when I was in 8th grade. And I was in a record store in the hippie section of Chicago, Old Town. And I saw this album cover and I thought, wow, that looks beautiful. And then as I looked closer, I thought, I know that line. I know what that line is. And I turned it over and saw that Rick had done this psychedelic lettering. And it was the first time in my life that I realized that I had some kind of perception, or, it was just an awakening that I can't really put into words when I knew that this was Rick before I turned it over and read that it was. And the big tragedy of this is that, see, he wrote the word stereo, but this was at a time when you could still buy mono records in monaural, and it says playable on stereo and mono phonographs. And he wrote that out by hand. And I've always wished that he had redrawn the Capitol Records logo rather than them stripping the actual one in, but he didn't. So later, when he came up to San Francisco and started doing posters, he would put Murphy in his posters. So he drew Murphy all his life, but he was divorced from Surfer magazine, amicably divorced. But here he is. This is the Hawaiian Country Joe poster, and this is just the drawing. I'm going to show you the full color version of this in a few minutes. But this one's kind of famous because the concert didn't come off and the printer didn't get paid, so they destroyed all the posters. and there are just a handful of them that survive. So they're really rare ones. And I'll show you the colored version of that in a second. But it looks a lot like this. This is the quintessential Rick Griffin poster with his version of Stanley's psychedelic spindly lettering. But look how angular he's made it. Again, with an outline and a really deep shade on it. Plus, he worked in primary colors a lot, and that's because these posters were all mechanically separated. They didn't have money for photo separations. A photo separation for a poster this big in those days would have cost about $300. So all the posters that were designed for all that stuff, the Fillmore and the Avalon and all that, all mechanically separated. And they did it in a couple of different ways. This is a poster by Ida Griffin, and Ida and Rick met at Chenard Art School in Southern California and ended up in San Francisco together. And one of the things that I found out just the other day, I assumed that Ida and Rick came up here together, but Ida was from Santa Cruz, and she had left school and moved into San Francisco, and Rick came up to join her later. And she lived next door to Stanley Mouse and Alton Kelly in an apartment building. And she was the one who introduced Rick and Stan and Kelly, which I'd never heard before. But the other day when Ida was in the class, we were talking about this poster. She said that this olive color was a gigantic disappointment. And because they had to do these things mechanically, they would do the drawings in black and white and then strip in the colors. So she had 3 colors to use, the yellow and the blue, and they were hoping for a green. And so it was one of those things where you didn't know what it was going to look like until it got on the press. And they were gigantically disappointed with how dull this olive green is. And I've always loved it. But she said it was meant to be a different green. So early on, they would do the drawing, and then they would just give the drawing to the printers and call out the colors, and the printers would strip in the colors. And this one is kind of cool. You can just see the corner of this poster. The original, wherever I saw this, and it was at Ida's house, Ida let me I took over 1,000 pictures on slide film back in the 90s. And this was one of them. And this is Rick's call outs for the printer for the different plates. And he was saying to use the warm, straight warm red, and then he made up this black, East Algerian Afro Sundown black. He just wanted a dark black, I guess. And because he didn't have any control over this, that's when they started to do it themselves. And what they would do is do that drawing. So here's that Country Joe and the Fish, the Hawaiian one. They would do the black and white drawing and then take it to the printers, and the printers would print them out blue lines on paper. So the blue line wouldn't be photographed by the copy camera. And then they could draw the colors they wanted for each one of the plates right on these different blue lines. So this is the blue plate, obviously, of this poster, and this is the yellow plate for this poster above it here. And the most amazing example of this is the Oxomoxoa poster and album cover. This is the 3rd Grateful Dead album cover. Rick had done this poster first, and they liked it so much they wanted to use it for their 3rd album, for the cover of the 3rd album. And so they stripped out they took out all the bands when it was a poster and just put in the word Oxomoxoa. Rick loved palindromes, so he actually named the album for him. So it was AOXOMA, backwards. And the album cover has that across the bottom. But when Rick died in 1991, it was a motorcycle crash in Petaluma. The obituary in the Chronicle, they quoted Jerry Garcia as saying that the most interesting thing about the Grateful Dead's 3rd album was the album cover, not music, but the cover itself. And the beautiful thing here, I'm going to zoom in a little bit, just see, I hope we can get in close. The moire pattern of this photograph is making this a little hard to see, but he did this blend by using Zipatone. Any of you remember Zipatone? It was a halftone, and you get solid halftones, or you could get halftones that faded, so that if you wanted some kind of a blend, you could buy it. It was just adhesive sheets, and you could cut it apart like Rubylith.
Yeah, I had it too.
Yeah, a lot of us worked on this, and it was the same time as rub down letters, right? It was related to
Yeah,
rub down letters
absolutely.
and zip a line as well. This was Zip-A-Tone. I hope I called it that first. And zip a line was you'd buy these little rolls of tape with different kinds of rules on them. But Rick knew from his original that he didn't have enough room to have one piece of Zip-A-Tone to make it all the way across. So look how he cut it in this smoke, pattern, so that where they overlapped was a deliberate design choice rather than just hoping that he could get the two things to line up, and you can't get them to line up evenly. So it was just in the slides I have a close-up of this, and this is as much as I can show you, but it just shows you his genius of how he worked on stuff. And every bit of this was drawn in black and white, every color done in black and white. So all this stippling that you're seeing here and in the sun, except for this Zip-A-Tone in the background, he drew all of this in black and white, hoping that it would look like this. And he was kind of a genius at it. And just the other day, I found this great picture of him sitting here with the beginning of the Oxomoxo poster, the black and white drawing that he's done of that. So it's just these two little things. And the other day, in the class, somebody said, "Oh, look at all these, these embryos here." And I said, I asked Adelia if she minded if I mentioned this. I said, those are the earliest portraits of Adelia Griffin, and she was in the room with us. And he drew this while Ida was pregnant with Adelia. So really sweet. Here's Gary Houston again, and very Rick Griffin style letters for this Soundgarden poster. Really angular look at those letters, but this is definitely Rick. And an interesting thing here is that this is the positive lettering, and here it's reversed, so we get the mirror. And then the other bands are positive on the right side and backwards on the left. So he's flip-flopping what's positive and what's reversed. And here's another one of, and again, remember, these are hand-colored, and here's Rick doing the black and white drawing, the first thing that they do, and then they would go get the blue lines made and figure out the colors. But see this empty panel here, this one panel, once he got down here, he just thought, I'm not sure what I want to do with that. So he asked he asked Stanley to do that panel. And at Rick's retrospective exhibition in 2007, I got Stanley to stand next to it and point to it. So this is the one panel that he did. This is kind of a landmark. This is a family dog poster, but R. Crumb saw this poster and he realized that he didn't have to tell stories every time that he did a comic strip. He could be abstract because this was, there isn't a story going on here. Everyone is just different. And here's Murphy making another appearance in the North. I think this might have been the first poster that Rick put Murphy in. Crumb says that this poster was very influential in liberating him from the idea of what kind of stories he could tell in Zap Comics. Not only that, he invited Rick to become a comic book artist for Zap Comics. So the first couple of Zaps are just R. Crumb, but after that it expanded to lots and lots of different artists. So just to show you how great he was, the pen and ink was always his original art medium, and he did start painting, but for all the posters, because they were mechanical, he would draw them with a pen to begin with and then separate them. And these are a couple of travel log comic strips, one for Maui and one for Mexico, to just show you how great a lettering artist he was, as well as what an amazing draftsman he turned out to be. And this was my first cover, maybe my first printed thing ever for a local weekly. And I copied Rick's Mexico lettering for that big F. Those capitals were the manipulated style of caps I was doing with a bamboo pen at the time. And this is early pointed brush, But this was another one of those things where I just gave them black and white artwork, not even in proportion. I gave them this piece of artwork and this piece of artwork in black and white, and then the art director stripped in all the colors, and he put in this moire pattern in the background on purpose. And for some reason, he loved this. It was such a great thing when I saw the result, because again, I had no idea even what he was going to do, besides not, if I had done the colors, I would have had to guess how they were going to come out after it was printed. But he was really happy with it, so I knew that meant I was going to get more cover art from this news weekly. So finally, Rick got for these album covers, they finally had a budget to afford a photo separation. So this is an oil painting or an acrylic painting for the first, continuous, photo separated color thing, so he could work in full color. And here's the beautiful sketch of that. He did his own self-published comic book called Man from Utopia. And this is actually from a t-shirt that I have that was produced after Rick's death. But this is the page from Man from Utopia with his really illegible headline there that was drawn. But one of the few things where you can see Rick using a calligraphy pen for these abstract runes that he did, just imitating text. And then finally, the third youth movement that Rick was at the forefront of was the Southern California born again Christian thing that happened. And it really was a youth movement. I remember going back to my hometown of Covina and walking through the park, and here were all these young kids, dancing and celebrating Jesus in the park on a Sunday. So it was a big thing. And Rick went to work for Calvary Chapel after he was born again, moved from Northern California back to Southern California, and did lots of work for for the Calvary Chapel and some of their offshoots. So this was an album cover of Christian music. And this was, I owned this piece for a little while. I bought it from Ida, but then sold it to a rich collector when I finally bought this condo, and I sold it so I could carpet the place. But it's butcher paper with white gouache and black ink and charcoal. And it was on the back cover of this album. And actually, if we take a look at this lettering, it's actually cooler on the butcher paper. And the other interesting thing is all these paintings that Rick did for these Christian publishers in the 70s were so psychedelic. Even he was more psychedelicized by being born again almost than the drugs. But this interesting story here was that when he was painting this painting, it was the night that Lynyrd Skynyrd's plane went down. So he put this little skate kid in the crowd of Jesus riding the donkey into Jerusalem with a Lynyrd Skynyrd t-shirt on. And finally, the one time that I saw Rick use Rohrs lettering was this thing for the Ninth Wave, which was an exhibit at the Psychedelic Solution in New York City. And it says graphic tsunami. So there's a graphic tsunami of India ink rolling towards us in roller lettering here. This is a comp that he did for some Grateful Dead work he was doing in the 80s. And finally, I was commissioned by the widow of a huge Rick Griffin fan, who went by Murphy, as a matter of fact. There's another Murphy relative in the crowd tonight. That's Lee Littlewood's dog, Murphy, just passed away recently. It's really too bad. But Susan hired me to do Griffin style lettering for Murphy's headstone, and she wanted me to do her name as well because she's going to end up in there sometime soon. So I did dates in this style and did 0 through 9 as well, so that the gravestone guys could just paste it up when Susan finally dies. And I've never seen this, so I don't know if it got produced or not, but it's my take on Griffin style lettering, but it's a little stiff. Okay, and finally, Victor Moscoso. I remember being hugely influenced by this, just like the in high school, just like the roller lettering from Wes, in that it was these Western letters, but it was psychedelic because every round stroke could be cradled by the straight strokes that, these kind of poster Western letters would be square and straight, but there's something really simple but psychedelic about this. So this was also among the first kind of letters I ever drew. And it came from Victor, from his posters. I don't think he designed this poster, this album cover for Big Brother. It wasn't on Columbia at first. It was a tiny little label in Chicago. And he definitely didn't do this painted stuff. So it really looks like they may have stole this lettering from this poster that Victor did do, or maybe it was, hopefully he did get paid for this, but it came from that. So Victor was brought up in Brooklyn, and he went to school at Cooper Union and at Yale. So he studied with Joseph Albers at Yale. And so the chromatic vibration lettering came from his studies with Albers, where they were choosing these. And Victor was one of the ones who really played around with the idea of what color was doing. And he was also the first one to do these photo collages. And we'll see that was important to somebody else in a second. But he would design these images and draw them or use photographs, and he would print them in these two different colors because he knew when these were hung on the wall of the dance halls and the light shows were flickering the lights, that these wings would flap depending on whether the red light was on or the blue light was on, so that that his static images would move. So like this album cover, and in fact, this is the full sleeve of the album, the inside of the album cover of this album, Steve Miller. And just like that, with these heads would rock back and forth when the lights would flicker. So he did these, and this was his really famous letter style, where he would make the space between the letters be three-dimensional, so that the letters were the background to make it tough to read or impossible to read. And it said "Children of the Future" down below that. And here finally is a collaboration. These guys love to work together. They were all good friends. This was a collaboration between Rick Griffin and Victor Moscoso for a diptych of posters. The Family Dog had a ballroom in Denver as well as in San Francisco. So on the left is the San Francisco poster. On the right is the Denver poster. And they had hired Jim Kweskin to play at both places. And they got Rick and Victor to make this together. So you can see that there's a half-tone picture of Jim Kweskin, half on each one of these posters. And down in the lower, in the ground, is Victor's lettering, where he would have these flame letters as well as these plant-like letters. Was a real common thing to see in his posters. And the other thing we're seeing here on Rick's part of the poster was that he came in and he hand drew this halftone and put a little shine on every halftone dot. Isn't that obsessively wonderful? Yeah, these guys were great. Rick died before he could do the cover for Zap 13, the 13th edition of Zap Comics. And so Victor took over for him. I always heard that it was one more deadline that Rick was going to miss, because he was famous for missing deadlines. And Victor did the front and the back. We're seeing the back, of course, on the left and the front on the right. And so he's got the angel Rick on the front, the devil Rick on the back, surfing a wave of flames, and this wonderful tribute to his friend. And Rick is, and the flying eyeball are writing pencils and a brush and a rapidograph pen and a pencil. Really beautiful. Victor could really draw. He was famous for these collages, but in the photo work on his posters, but he could draw like a son of a gun. So finally, this was the man in the last issue of the magazine that I thought should join the big five, David Singer, and he came along later, and he was hugely into photo collage, but he was inspired by Victor to do that. And so he did a bunch of these collages and took them to Victor and said, what should I do with them? And he said, take them to Bill Graham. And he walked into Bill Graham's office, and Bill Graham gave him a dozen posters to do for the summer series using the collages that he had shown him. But then he had to do the lettering, which he hadn't ever done professionally before. Bill Graham asked him if he could letter. He says, oh, yeah. And so that first series of posters used this Art Deco style lettering with different bands, of course, down across the bottom for 12 different posters. So pretty good for his first commercial lettering job. But as time went by, he started to get more flow in his work and more psychedelic, but then he never outlined stuff. So it was the thing that really set him apart, was that he had this really psychedelic flavor to these letters. And these letters, by the way, are very influenced by Alphonse Mucha. In one of those first Mucha posters I showed you, these letters here. This is the double wide poster for the closing week of the Fillmore. In 1971, Graham decided to close the Fillmore Auditorium really abruptly. And it was so fast they didn't even do the posters for the show. This was produced after the week was over as a commemorative thing. Actually, his staff did it as a gift for Bill Graham and hired David to do that. But David was hired in 68, which was relatively late in the time span of the psychedelic posters of the 60s. And he ended up doing more posters for the Fillmore than anybody else, 66 of them. And he was also friends with another collage artist who was in psychedelic posters, Wilfred Satie, who just went by Satie. And they shared a studio for a while, and he said that their relationship was that they would go for coffee and cut out pictures together. But he had collected photographs since he was a little boy, and he would also go to antique stores. So this was a photo they found in an antique store. He still has the original. I took this picture at his house in March, but he would use that kind of stuff on the poster. So one more example of him finally getting a psychedelic flow in his letters after a lot of geometric stuff. And he always used his collage. This is a poster for the 70th year of the Toulouse-Lautrec lithography. So there's another portrait of Toulouse-Lautrec here and his logo again. He loved Victor's negative area lettering. This is a t-shirt for the Rock Poster Society, who puts on the poster event in Golden Gate Park every summer. And another poster, this was for the 30th anniversary of the Summer of Love in the 1990s, using Victor's idea of, three-dimensionalizing the negative area in between. And a little more of his work. Moon Alice is a band that was started by a venture capitalist. So he's got some money, and he's totally devoted to the psychedelic poster. And he's the reason, what's his name? Roger McNamee. McNamee? There might be another way of pronouncing that. And he hired David to do the 21st in the series of the 1300. And David ended up doing more of those than any of the other artists. He's done 122 of them. And he designed the Moon Alice logo. So here's one of the Moon Alice posters. And this is a modern day guy. He's a friend of Rick Griffin's. So we have this email group of Griffin nuts called FORG, Friends of Rick Griffin. And Scott McDougall lives in Seattle. He put out a book about 5 years ago about all the psychedelic posters from the Seattle area in the 60s. So here's his, and he updates these psychedelic letter styles in such a beautiful way. This is the new edition, newly expanded edition of the book. So here he is doing the Wes Wilson lettering. I love these colors. And I wasn't crazy about the face on this woman, but then I realized that it was from a Mucha poster. So he's kind of faithful to the the face on the Mucha poster. And here's another one from the mid-90s, and you'll probably recognize this as Fay Ray from King Kong. And here's Scott's tribute to Rick, and a simplified version of Rick's style of lettering by Scott. Lastly, here in Santa Cruz, we've got Jim Phillips, who's famous for doing the graphics for Santa Cruz skateboards, but he was also a psychedelic poster artist. This is from the 80s and 90s. The Tubes played here in Santa Cruz twice, at the Del Mar Theater and the Civic Auditorium, and he did these letters like the Blob from the 50s horror movie. And he was one of the first ones to start using the computer to do the psychedelic posters. As we left the 90s and went into the 2000s, Jim was one of the first to use a computer for these posters. And now there's lots of them happening that way. So this last section is just a couple of the modern day psychedelic poster artists, Emick, and this is from the Art of Modern Rock, which in itself is probably 15 years old now. So these are the 21st century versions of the psychedelic poster. And Moon Alice is a big part of this, in that they have done 1,300 posters here in the 21st century, and almost all of these would have been done on the computer, which means there's a lot more type being used on these posters. And David himself did it a lot. Here are 3 of David's, and David found it hugely liberating to use the computer to design his posters, because when he did his collage work before, just whatever he cut out of the magazines, he had to use it at that size. He had to use it in those colors. So when he started working on the computer, he could resize things, and it just was a revolution for his collage. But he did start to use type a lot more often than the hand lettering that happened on the psychedelic posters. And believe me, every one of those psychedelic posters that we saw from the 60s were hand lettered, every bit of it. They weren't using type for any of it. And then finally, I've just always been influenced by it. So you get stuck with just a few of my attempted psychedelic calligraphy tries. And what do we have for the last? Oh, here's that image again of the poster exhibition in Germany in the first decade. And then this is just a reminder that something like this is happening at San Francisco MoMA just next week. I found out about this because MoMA was in touch with David Singer and his agent about using his posters it's called The Art of Noise is the name of the exhibition, and it opens, previews are next week, May 2nd and 3rd, and it's open to non-members of the museum starting the week after that. So you're going to want to see this. I think you'll be able to see original versions of David's posters as well as everybody else. Here's Bob Seidemann. This is a whole Moscoso section right here. I think there's going to be a lot of it. It's devoted to art and music. So, sorry that took so long, but that's it.
Thank you, Carl. That was great. That was a great presentation. I really enjoyed that. Let me take the spotlight off of you here. Yeah, I haven't heard about a lot of these artists. You knew Rick Griffin and Stan Mouse. Did you ever meet Wes Wilson or any of the other artists that you spoke about?
I never met Wes, and I barely knew Stan. I was so shy when I went to visit him. He's really friendly, but he trusted me enough to let me have those drawings for a while back in the 90s. And when I see him, actually, I'll bring him a copy of that issue. I gave him a few at the time, but just in case he lost them, there's so few extras, because we just printed them for us. it's a kind of a rarity. And I think that if more people knew about it, it might actually be an expensive psychedelic artifact for Stanley Mouse fans. But I never did meet Rick. He had an opening. There was a gallery called Best Comics in the Cannery, and he was supposed to be at the opening. And I walked up and I locked eyes with him. He was getting in his truck and driving away. And I thought he was just parking the truck after dropping some stuff off. And then he never came back. So I never got to meet him, and he died in the motorcycle accident just a couple weeks later. But I met his widow and the rest of his family when I started to do the obituary. And then by this amazing stroke of luck, Adelia moved into the house behind me, and one house over. We were, checkerboarded from each other, and her garage was full of Rick's artwork, and we became really, really good friends then. And I know this is going on too long, but my wife had an aunt who lived to be 103, and for her 100th birthday, they had a big party. And Adelia worked for the baker in town, and I went to her and asked her to decorate the cake for Aunt Mildred's 100th birthday. And it was a big sheet cake with decoration on it. And I walked into this party and I wanted to say, Rick Griffin's daughter decorated this cake, but nobody there gave a shit, because they were all in their 80s and 90s. Really funny. And another sidelight to that is her name is Mildred Snitzer. So Sharon's great aunt is the person that Jeff Goldblum's jazz trio, the Mildred Snitzer Orchestra, is named after. She was friends with Jeff Goldblum's mother back in Pittsburgh, and he named it just as a joke. He was never in touch with her after that, but she got a gigantic kick that she was the inspiration for the name of Jeff Goldblum's jazz trio. You can see him talking about that online someplace, like on Seth Meyers or something. We can go on forever here. I see here in the chat that Bronwyn said that Leslie Cabarga did both Peace and Love, and that's really good to be reminded. And Lee, you had your hand up?
What about Sickles? Sickles lettering is what I've called all of that thin line breaking stuff up. And he was a real person, apparently, an American.
Yeah, I've heard that name from Harvest Crittenden, that it's a certain kind of traditional lettering style, engrossing letter style, but I didn't know it was a person, so I don't know about that.
Okay, I'll send you all I've got, because it could well be parallel evolution at about the same time.
Uh-huh. All right. Okay, anybody else? Good. I know you want to get up here. I thought that would go faster, but
No, that was excellent. That was fascinating. That was a little bit after my time. I grew up kind of in the 70s, so I didn't really, I saw a lot of their artwork in the 70s. A lot of people were imitating that kind of artwork in the 70s, but I didn't really know that much about Moscoso, Wilson, and Rick and Griffin at that time. So very interesting.
It was the kind of lettering I was into before I ever heard the word calligraphy. So it's even though calligraphy took over my life, it was always part of it. It's always been part of the line, so even the most traditional, and I never really do much traditional, it's influenced by psychedelic lettering for sure.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Well, I was around then, Carl. I had a silkscreen company from 1965, and a lot of these people were around me here in San Francisco, and a couple of them were doing all the rock and roll T-shirts for Winterland and Bill Graham, and so I got connected, and so I did a lot of work for Bill Graham and Winterland. But my silkscreen company started off first with cutting everything by Rubylith, and I did most of the cutting. But I just wanted to let you know that I was there.
Well, you were working exactly the way Rick was, because Ida mentioned the other day that they were definitely cutting things out of Rubylith, not just the Zippoline stuff, that if he had big areas, they also cut stuff.
Yeah.
backgrounds and stuff. But he just loved to draw so much that, you know, I knew that was part of it. And I've actually never seen any of those separations where I saw any rubylith. It was always India ink. So, but she said they did use that too.
Yeah.
You know, Gary Houston silk screens all of his posters. So his really elaborate stuff.
Yeah.
Lee, have you ever been over to Gary's place?
Never been to a shop, no.
Okay. Anyway,
It was fun
Well,
times.
I'll bet. Sounded like great times. I'm sorry I missed it. Oh, Kristen's got the Archibald Knox catalog. Isn't it wonderful? Where'd you get that?
I wrote to the Isle of Man
Uh-huh.
and they sent me this. This was after you did a presentation at one of the conferences and you introduced us to his work. And so I wrote to them and I bought this somehow. This was years ago, but I don't remember if we were emailing even then. This was so long ago. So
I think it's pretty rare to have one of those. Yours looks like it's really good shape too.
yep. I think it says Manx National Heritage 6
Yeah.
on the back.
Yeah. Christ
So,
Protect Me is on the back.
yeah.
All right. Well, I don't even remember doing a presentation about him that much. I'm so glad you were there for that.
Yeah.
It was funny.
Thank you so much, Carl.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carl. That was an excellent presentation. I really enjoyed that. Don't miss next month's Blackletter Brunch, in which calligrapher and teacher Rachel Yallop will give a presentation on the ever fascinating line. That's going to be on Sunday, May 19th at 10 a.m. Thank you very much for joining us.
Okay, good.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for your patience.